Hey, dirtbag! Yoo-hoo! Dirtbag! Hey, dirtbag!
What the hell do you want?
Just checking you got a handle on your new name.
The gaming industry has really changed and evolved in the last 10 to 15 years. Many aspects in how games are approached are extremely different than it was, such as a focus on narrative, online play, DLC, patches, microtransactions, the list goes on and on. We're at a point where if even one game flops, it could lead to bankruptcy. So developers of course will want to get a game on every console that is profitable to have a chance of making a profit, or at the very least break even. This wasn't always the case though. Back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, they were allowed to take a chance here and there, and not go to business if it didn't pay off. There was a bit of freedom. In fact, ports of a game that were released around the same time would have some noticeable differences. A game on a Nintendo system could look or play nothing like its Sega or Sony counterpart. And today I introduce a spin-off of my reviews called Same Diff. A segment where I'll take a look at two different versions of the same game and then compare the two on which one I think is the better version. All the while poking fun at some of the weird stuff. Believe me, this game is fucking weird. So today we're going to be looking at Rayman 2: The Great Escape, considered by some to be possibly the best platformer of its generation. Rayman, Rayman, Rayman. When it comes to video games, you truly are in your own world, aren't you? You've been around since 1995, yet you're still not considered a classic video game character like Mario, Sonic, Mega Man, or Crash. Every main installment in your series has been praised, yet your games don't get brought up or mentioned much. You were popular enough to get your own spin-off series, yet the Rabbids even overshadowed you for a while. And whenever you're brought up to be a potential newcomer for Smash Brothers, you get just as many people who are against the idea as there are supporters for you. Although, to be fair, you can say that about a few characters. The Rayman series is really interesting when you look at it that way. Each game in the main series has been praised by varying degrees for its creativity, unique gameplay aspects, and for being really polished, and Rayman 2 is no exception. In fact, Rayman 2: The Great Escape is the only game that I can think of that was able to achieve something that no other platformer at the time was able to do. That I'm aware of, anyway. Hell, Mario wouldn't even fully achieve this until Galaxy, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's start this off with the story and the presentation. We're in a world called the Glade of Dreams, and it's been completely taken over by an army of robot pirates led by the fearsome Admiral Razorbeard, and in the process destroyed the heart of the world's core. This has even led our hero being captured, as the world core is what powers him. Upon the prison ship, we see a blue frog named Glowbox being captured too, and is thrown into a cell with Rayman. This was a ploy as Glowbox allowed himself to be captured to give Rayman back some of his powers, which allows him to break free, and then they get separated pretty quickly. But soon after, Rayman finds out that Lee, the fairy, who gave Glowbox the silver lum to give to Rayman, has been captured too. So he sets out to free her and soon finds out that, to defeat the pirates, he'll need the help from a being known as Polycus. I guess he's like God, as he's referred as the spirit, and supreme creator of the world, but has been in a deep sleep in some other world. And to be awoken, 4 ancient masks will need to be reunited, or else the world will fall into slavery. Pretty dark plot and opening for a kid's game when you think about it, you know? You start off defeated and broken. You lost. But it sets the mood of the game perfectly. It might be whimsical and fantasy-like, but it's a very dark fantasy when it needs to be. Probably the darkest the series has ever gotten, and I welcome it. So when it comes to the story, it pretty much goes through the same scenarios for both versions. But possibly the biggest difference that many will notice is that the PS1 version has full-on voice acting, while the N64 has made-up gibberish. So which one do I think is better? That's kind of a tricky one, actually. Because on the one hand, the characters on the N64 version sound a lot more natural. Well, as natural as you can get for a series like this. Whereas the PS1 version has voice work done in an era where voiceovers in video games were pretty hit or miss. And this is no exception.
Oh, not the end. Glowbox bring good gift from Lee.
Lee the fairy?
It's not the worst I've ever heard, but some parts can be pretty cringy. A good example is Razorbeard. Here he's pretty much Saturday morning cartoon evil.
What? You incompetent imbecile! Send the warship and destroy him!
Meanwhile, the more robotic voice makes him sound a lot more intimidating in the N64 version, which fits the darker theme of the game a lot better. But while I prefer the gibberish, I can't really complain about the voice acting either. When it's at its best, it's decent enough. And at its worst, well, it's pretty fucking hilarious.
Damn, I forgot to fill up the tank. Damn.
Whoa, hey! What the fuck are you doing? Dropping a D-bomb in an E-rated game like this. Do you know I got impressionable kids here who I've just managed to get to say cocksucker and motherfucker on a regular basis? I don't need you poisoning their minds with safe curse words. So smarten the fuck up. Surprisingly though, I found the story in the PS1 version was a bit better despite the wonky voice acting. Now both games follow the same story, but I noticed the PS1 version fleshes it out a bit better, such as when you meet the second Guardian in the Sanctuary of Fire and Stone. If the first Guardian was anything to go by, one would think that you're about to have a boss fight, but once you swing on his head, he just walks down the hallway and commits suicide, and you're left there thinking, wait, what? That's it? Did I break the game or something? Cause I don't think bosses are supposed to do that. But you find out in the PS1 version that Lee contacted him and he agreed to help by getting you across, and even lets you know about an upcoming boss fight. Like, little things like that add up, and I have to give the edge to the PS1 version when it comes to the story because of such little things. So let's talk about the gameplay, you know, the actual important stuff. Rayman 2 plays like any traditional 3D platformer of the era, or no, wait a minute. Maybe not so traditional, because compared to most 3D platformers at the time, Rayman 2 is one of the more unique platformers. This was a time when sandbox-style 3D games ruled. Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and Donkey Kong 64 all had that free-roam style where different objectives and collectibles were the goal of the game. Rayman 2 doesn't do that. It adapts the classic get from point A to point B formula that most platformers a generation before still abided by. Now, I know some of you are probably going to say, well, aren't you forgetting Crash? Or some are probably shouting, you're omitting Crash to make Rayman 2 look more unique. Crash just got a kick-ass remake, so they are the perfect 3D linear platformers, you asshole. Or I'm thinking too far into things. Could be that. And yes, it is true. Crash is the very definition of getting from point A to point B gameplay, but I always felt Rayman 2 was better at it. Crash, while a lot of fun, I always felt the level design was just a little too much hallway syndrome and didn't feel like a big adventure. Rayman 2 managed to keep its traditions of the previous 2D game, but it still had the big and adventurous level design like Mario and Banjo had, which encouraged you to explore for the yellow lums and cages, this game's collectibles. So much like most 3D platformers, Rayman can run in any direction, attack enemies with his glowing balls, you sick fuck, and can use his hair as a minicopter to slow his descent and make some of the platforming a bit easier. Between the two, Rayman controls pretty much the same, but you can tell the N64 version has a lot more polish to it as Rayman reacts to his surroundings a bit better. PS1 Rayman feels like he's constantly fighting with the terrain, and the camera too for that matter. It isn't unplayable, but it's noticeable when you play both. The N64 version is also a lot longer than the PS1 version. Either levels were cut entirely, or they were shortened and or missing sections. But the benefit is, some levels are completely different than its N64 counterpart, which playing this right after the N64 version, yeah, well, it kinda kept things fresh. Though I'm not really viewing this as a bonus. Cut content is cut content, but at least it softens the blow a bit. You also run into Murphy throughout the game, a frog-like fairy that likes to interrupt your gameplay to give you useless info. No, seriously? Fuck this little twat. This guy will come in at random moments to tell you something, but either A, you already know, or B, it's just common sense. The absolute worst is when you're in the Sanctuary of Fire and Stone. In this level, you're introduced to the Plum, an object that has many purposes like riding it across lava, reaching higher ledges, attacking enemies with it, etc. For the first portion of this level, you're learning and figuring out how to use it, and for the most part, it's not that hard to figure out. But after you use them to get to the second portion of the stage, this little fuckhead comes in and is like, oh, right on, you learn how to use the Plum to your advantage, but just in case, I'm gonna tell you about all the things you can do with them despite already fucking doing so 10-20 minutes ago. And it's like, really? Are we seriously stopping the game for this? And on top of it, if you were gonna tell me this, wouldn't it have been better to let me know ahead of time? Yeah, Navi's got nothing on this little fuckface. Get out, get the fuck out. No one fucking likes you, you little green prick. Hey, what the hell are you doing? You doing? Stop, please, stop. No, don't you fucking... Thankfully, this isn't a thing in the PS1 version. He's been demoted to cage duty and Lee takes over hints, which is just a little text. No more, no less, and that's fine by me. But speaking of cages, lums are the main collectible of the game which serve two purposes, allowing passage into the sanctuaries and bragging rights. Well, the PS1 version has an Easter egg where if you collect 90% of them, you unlock a demo of the scrap 2D version of 2. So that's cool, but other than that, collecting them does nothing. The other collectible is the cages, which you need to break to either free lums in the N64 version, or fairies, chickens, and Murphys in the PS1 version. Ha! Fuck you, you little cocksucker. If I knew exactly which ones they were, you would never get free. Fuck you. Cages to me are worth going for since the more you break, the more your health bar increases. For the N64 version, you get a health upgrade every 10 cages and they're filled with yellow lums to compensate. PS1, as I mentioned, has the fairies, chickens, and Murphys, which will upgrade your health a little every time you break one. Personally, I like the N64 version's approach better. You feel accomplished when you break every 10th cage, and more times than not, they have yellow lums in them. and getting a bunch of any main collectible is always going to feel rewarding. The PS1 cages to me just don't feel as fulfilling as you get a health upgrade for every cage you break. There's no sense of accomplishment like you get with the N64 cages, plus you get fully healed alongside the upgrade, so it pretty much kills off any difficulty the game might have had, for the most part. So half the battle of most platformers is the enemies you face. You have the pirates, the green eyeball creatures, shadow spirits or whatever the hell they're called, piranhas and zombie chickens, and...
Fuck you, game.
Nope, no. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the cause of my 10-year-old self shitting his pants. Fuck, I hate these things. Spiders in general can just fuck right off, but this asshole pops out of nowhere and constantly chasing you with that music that goes along with it. Ugh. Even now, I don't like looking at them, but even then they aren't the worst thing in this game. Nope, that title goes to the yellow lumps. Well, I should say the placement of the yellow lumps. No, actually I should say the trial and error of some of these lumps. Throughout Rayman 2, there will be parts of the game where you'll be having a bit of a different playstyle, such as these slope sections or the walking shell parts like I mentioned earlier. Each of them have you trying to get through these parts by dodging obstacles on a set path as you're forced to keep moving forward. It can be tricky, but nothing impossible. But the developers seem to have a hard-on with adding lumps to these sections, and the trial and error aspect gets intensified big time because now you're trying to collect them as well as make it to the end. But if you're like me, you're going to want to collect all of them. Well, you might have a miserable time because if you miss one, and just one, well, your only option is to commit suicide so you can respawn at the beginning of these gimmicky sections and try a fucking gun. Thankfully, Rayman 2 does have a checkpoint system, so you'll always respawn and lives aren't a thing in this game. Game over just means you start at the beginning of the section you're in. Actually, now that I think about it, it was very ahead of its time in that regard. But oh my god, it's so aggravating. Especially when you get to the point where you only have one chance to grab them like here. That's fucking bullshit. In fact, this happened a couple times in the normal sections too, like who the hell is gonna know that was there on their first try? But this is why I say just collect the lums that are needed. Save yourself some time because they start to become pretty redundant near the end. Was there any reason to have yellow lums on the final stage? No, it just makes the most gimmicky trial and error level that much harder. But just when you think the troubles are over, no, then there's the final fucking boss that can suck my fucking dick. This is hands down one of the shittiest bosses I've ever had to deal with. It's all because they wanted to force you to ride this flying shell, which you most likely got a lot of practice from in the previous section due to how tricky it is to master and control this stupid thing. But it doesn't start off that way. In fact, it's pretty cool at first. You start off by dodging his attacks and hitting his bombs back at him to damage him, but it doesn't last long. All the jumping around he does to try and squish you ends up making the floor collapse. Then they all fall down and Rayman lands beside something that should make any player cringe since you just went through this hell about 10 minutes ago. Yep, the final battle is on this fucking thing where one wrong move sends these tight fucking corridors with rising lava and dodging homing missiles when more times than not it leads you to being blown up and having to restart! But that's not even the worst part! No, you dummy. Let's make it where every time you fuck up and blow up, Razorbeard's health resets. Fuck! Yep, I'm not kidding you. You could have him on a sliver of life left because you just happen to mess up. Well, the fight restarts and you have to do it all over again. That's fucking retarded. Like seriously, a no hit and run is usually just an extra challenge in a video game like some of the Prankster comics in the Mario Galaxy games. And even then it's still based on the core gameplay. This is just gimmicky as hell and it makes things so much more aggravating every time you screw up because you know the only reason why you're screwing up is because of the stupid ass controls of the flying fucking show. If there was a live system in place, I probably would have shot myself. But I have been talking about the N64 version this whole time. You can only imagine how much I was sweating the idea of having to play this part in the technically inferior PS1 version.
God, I don't want to play the bad level again. It's gonna beat me. Wait a minute. No lums? No level gimmicks? A final boss that's fun and actually challenging for all the right reasons? What the hell happened here?
This has been known as the lesser version of Rayman 2, yet this final level and boss blows the N64 version away. This is hands down the best boss in any version of Rayman 2 before the remake. It doesn't restart the fighting once you get hit once, your life bar actually means something. And it's such a creative battle since it continues the idea of having his weapons destroy himself, but it turns it into a fun space shooter that keeps things entertaining. Kudos PS1 Rayman 2, you might have been inferior to the N64 version in a lot of ways, but this is not one of them. But that's Rayman 2 for the N64 and PlayStation 1, so what's the verdict? Well, I think there's a reason why the N64 version is the one that's been ported and updated over the years. It's just a much better game in general. Gameplay feels a lot more polished, Rayman moves fluently, he hits what you want him to hit, and platform what he's supposed to platform. And there wasn't many times where I felt a screw up was the game's fault, I just sucked. Presentation just felt a lot stronger too. Even without the technical advantage, no loading times was a huge plus, and characters sounded a bit more natural in their gibberish language, I felt. It might not have told the story as good as the PS1 version, but you're still able to understand what's going on for the most part. The music, well, I'll let you make the call on that one. Plus, this version feels more complete since it's not missing anything, so you get more bang for your buck. I might not have liked everything about it, mostly the last level and some of those fucking lums, but all in all, it's just a much better fleshed out game despite a couple missteps. The PS1 version, on the other hand, feels like it could have used a few more months to polish it, because as it is, it's definitely a downgrade, not because of the PS1's limits. As I mentioned, Rayman's movements feel off here. He doesn't react to his surroundings as good, so I was making mistakes that I normally wouldn't make. And fighting with the camera wasn't doing it any favors. The presentation in terms of story was hit or miss. I like the fact that they fleshed out the story a bit more, but the voice acting? Again, you can tell it was early 2000s video game voice acting. Also, like I mentioned, it's a much shorter game that's only about 70% of the content of the original, so it's not hard to see why the PS1 version is the bastard child of the Rayman 2 ports. But that's not to say you should completely ignore this version. In fact, quite the contrary. If you're a fan of Rayman 2, then I recommend you give this one a shot. Given I don't recommend it over any port that's based on the N64 version, but the PS1 version isn't a bad game either. There wasn't a time where I was like, screw this game, I'm done with it. I had no problem completing it despite its setbacks. And it helps that it does its own thing, and in some cases, does it better. To me, the best way to describe Rayman 2 on the PS1 is like it's a beta version that we actually got to play, which includes another playable beta build. That's kind of amazing when you put it that way. Nonetheless, it's familiar in ways of the original game, but does enough things differently to give the player a different take on it, and not feel like you're slogging through another port. That alone, I feel, gives a reason for it not to be overlooked. But with that, I declare the winner to be the N64 version.